cause of death has been ascribed to hypertensive heart disease and coronary artery heart disease as a contributory factor.
Dr. Francisco has for the last 6 months refused our repeated requests for an interview. He did, however, grant an interview to Joan Draghi. Joan is a reporter for WHBQ. That's the ABC affiliate station in Memphis.
Your opinion is that Elvis did not die of drugs.
That's correct.
Given another doctor, however, he might come up with a different conclusion.
Absolutely.
Given those different opinions and disagreements, some disagreements between other doctors and yourself, and given the new information on Dr. Nichopoulos, the charges, do you have any objection to reopening the Elvis case?
Well, there's nothing to reopen. The charges against Dr. Nichopoulos have absolutely nothing to do with the cause of Elvis's death. There's no relationship.
So despite the original autopsy findings, and despite the new information derived from this and other investigations, medical examiner Francisco continues to insist, first, that drugs played no role in Elvis Presley's death, and that secondly, there is no new information that would cause Dr. Francisco to reconsider his official opinion. Because of the technical nature of this case, 2020 has retained the services of Dr. John Fiegel. Currently the deputy medical examiner in Atlanta, Dr. Fiegel has 20 years' experience in investigating suspicious deaths.
How do you characterize Dr. Francisco's decision that the fact that Elvis Presley received 196 prescriptions for over 12,000 pills was not relevant to the cause of death?
Well, I would have to disagree. I think that it is relevant and probably very significant.
Would you, if you were the medical examiner on this case, reopen this case?
I would open it this very afternoon if that were something that I just learned.
Francisco tells of consulting 2 oncologists. He goes on to reported there was no evidence that the drugs in Elvis's body caused or made any significant contribution to his death. By that toxicologist, his name is Dr. Brian Finkel of the University of Utah. Dr. Finkel told us that based on the limited information Francisco provided him at the time, he was unable to form any opinion on the cause of death. He told us also that he so informed Dr. Francisco. Our outside expert mentioned press release was subsequently identified by us as Dr. Robert Blanke of the Medical College of Virginia. Francisco that the drugs found in the body individually did not represent an overdose. Neglected to include in his case was that Dr. Blanke went on to say that the drugs taken together were in fact consistent with a drug death.
Dr. Blanke gave me a letter which he wrote to Dr. Francisco shortly after that press release was made public. And in that letter, Dr. Blanke says, in part, however, without hesitation, I believe that all of these drugs combined at the levels described would be consistent with a drug death, even with tolerance to some, and so stated to you. Now, back to back, those 2 statements are not consistent, and the press release is at least less than candid.
Because so many people have been at least less than candid, there has never been a definitive official investigation of the Elvis Presley death and of the people and the practices which may have been in part responsible.
The hearing to determine whether Dr. Nick will lose his license to practice medicine is scheduled to begin in Memphis on January 14. The criminal investigation of Dr. Nick remains ongoing, and we will keep you posted.
All we knew when we began this investigation was that many of the people closest to Elvis Presley simply did not believe he really died of a heart attack. Now, the first break in this story came when we obtained a report on the drugs found in Elvis's body at the time of his death. They were all prescription drugs, legal medicine. So we started looking for the licensed doctors who supplied Elvis whatever drug he wanted, whenever he wanted it.
Were there any doctors that said no to Elvis Presley?
Not that I know of. And I was around him for a long, long time. Not that I know of. Nobody hardly said no to Elvis Presley.
Our investigation uncovered willing doctors in Los Angeles and in Las Vegas. But it was in Elvis's hometown of Memphis that the evidence began pointing to Dr. George Nichopoulos. Dr. Nick was Presley's personal physician on and off for 11 years. He was a member of the inner circle of the entourage that surrounded and helped isolate Elvis inside the walls of Graceland and under a mountain of prescription medicine. Examiners began proceedings to revoke or suspend Dr. Nick's license to practice medicine. According to the board, the doctor had prescribed more than 12,000 narcotic pills and injections to Presley in just the last 20 months of his life. In his own defense, Dr. Nick explained how he cared for Elvis.
You can't imagine how big a nightmare this was for me. I mean,
tried to get psychiatric help. I tried to get him to go to sleep clinics. I tried to get him to get help from some other sources, and it was always either we'll do better or something. He just would not do it.
Two facts were confirmed during the week-long hearing. First, that Elvis had been a medical drug addict, hospitalized at least 3 times for detoxification. The second thing concerned Dr. Nick. It became clear that he led 2 lives. To most of his patients, he was a conscientious traditional family doctor. But to Elvis and to others who testified at the hearing, Dr. Nick was the source, the drug supplier.
So, Dr. Nicopolis, your license will be suspended for a period of 3 months, and the board will observe your activities in your practice for a period of 3 years.
Found guilty of 10 counts of overprescription, Dr. Nick's medical license was suspended for 3 months. He got off easily, but his legal problems were just beginning. A Shelby County grand jury began hearing testimony. Between February 20th and May 16th, 36 witnesses, most of them relatives, employees, and close friends of the late singer, pieced together the melancholy story of the last days of his life. Among the witnesses were Ginger Alden, who discovered his body on August 16th, 1977. Marty Lacker, best man in Presley's wedding to Priscilla, who testified as to his own addiction at the hands of Dr. Nick. Stepbrothers David and Ricky Stanley, who told the grand jury of Elvis's addiction. And Dr. Eric Muirhead, chief pathologist at Baptist Hospital in Memphis, who presented the autopsy report to the jurors and told them that Elvis had died of a combination of drugs. The investigators for the state of Tennessee screened all 40 hours of medical board hearings. In addition, they traveled to Los Angeles and Las Vegas, obtaining voluntary testimony from some other Presley intimates, like longtime manager Colonel Tom Parker, and from Linda Thompson, who went with Elvis after his divorce from Priscilla. Last Friday, the grand jury handed down its indictment. It accuses Dr. Nicopolis of unlawfully prescribing prescription drugs to Elvis Presley and to 10 other people, including another legend of rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis. In the case of both Jerry Lee and Elvis, there are actually 2 counts in the indictment. District Attorney General Hugh Stanton.
The second count alleges that those 2 individuals were addicted to controlled substances. It names the controlled substances, and it says that he continued to prescribe or did prescribe to them, not in a good faith effort to cure their addiction.
So almost 3 years after the death of Elvis Presley, his longtime personal physician has finally been indicted, in part because of the way he cared for his famous patient. If convicted, Dr. Nicopolis would face between 2 and 10 years in prison for each of the 14 counts. And ABC News has learned that the prosecution feels the case against him is airtight. For instance, in April and again in July of 1977, Dr. Nick's medical bag was reported stolen. After the contents had been taken, the bags were recovered by the police. Before returning the bag to the doctor, the police apparently copied down his schedules for dispensing drugs to Elvis Presley. In other words, from the doctor's own notes found inside his own medical bag, the state knows exactly what he gave to Elvis and when. Deborah Richardson worked briefly for Dr. Nick.
Deborah, was there ever an occasion when you had access to Dr. Nicopolis' office when you saw drugs in there that were earmarked for Graceland, Elvis Presley's home here in Memphis?
Yes, I went into his office one day, and there was a grocery bag on his desk, you know, about this wide and about this tall. It was on his desk, and a piece of paper was stapled to the bag. It had Graceland right across it, and I looked in it, and it was pharmaceutical samples.
Pharmaceutical samples heading toward Graceland. About how filled was that big grocery bag?
About half full.
Half full of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
The indictment of Dr. Nick is the end of just part of this story. There is still what we call the Elvis cover-up. It is the usual practice in criminal cases like this one for the county medical examiner to assist the state in its presentation to the grand jury. But in the case of Dr. Nick, Jerry T. Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner, was not even called in as an expert witness. Dr. Francisco, you may recall, is the man who has continued to insist that Elvis Presley died of a heart attack, despite the fact that the doctors who actually performed that autopsy almost 3 years ago have insisted since the beginning that Elvis Presley was apparently the victim of an accidental overdose of prescription medicine. Last summer, 2020 producer Charles Thompson and investigative reporter James Cole filed a lawsuit to force Dr. Francisco to make public the secret Elvis Presley autopsy. We maintain that that autopsy will prove that Elvis Presley died from the interaction of the prescription drugs in his system. Final arguments in that lawsuit will take place tomorrow morning in Memphis.
Thank you, Geraldo.